So Ravi, IoT has permeated into our everyday lives, right? Most of the devices and applications we use are interconnected and a part of a larger network. So given your experience with IoT at VMware, I wanted to get your thoughts on why securing IoT is super important for us right now.
Great. So much of the IoT infrastructure is really at the edge, where it's spread across, it's distributed, and the order of magnitude is extremely high compared to anything we see in the data centers. So what it really means at the end of the day is the threat surface has increased tremendously compared to what we have been used to, what we have seen in the past, in the last few decades. What it also means is the threat vectors are varied in nature at this point. There are too many of those, starting from very simple cases of getting access to some files or getting access to some data, all the way at the end of the spectrum to physical possession of some of those devices. These devices are out there, completely out there in the open with no physical boundaries. So that tremendously increases the threat vectors, the number of threat vectors out there. So that kind of necessitates a security paradigm to be established for IoT. And IoT, as it gets closer to IT, as enterprises start to treat IoT as IT, it also means that everything is getting connected. So IoT really becomes a channel to a lot of the internal resources as well. So once they get access to, once any of the hackers get access to IoT devices, they'll be able to permeate and get to the internal resources and wreak a lot of damage. So to that end, security is paramount for IoT, not just to protect the IoT devices, but really to protect all of the enterprise resources as well.
Right. So how do you think, what would you say are the first steps enterprises should take if they want to get started with their IoT security journey?
There are a few steps, right? So if you really look at some of the examples that keep coming up in front of our eyes day in and day out, for instance, target the HVAC systems, somebody getting access to those HVAC systems and then getting into the target internal networks based on that, or getting access to POS systems to get to the internal networks. So a lot of regulations have been put in place. For instance, California has come up with a reasonable security has to be built into every one of the IoT devices moving forward. This was a law they enacted in 2019. And UK has come up with a bit more specific on some of these rules where firmware updates are a necessity at this point. And unique passwords, for instance, on some of the archaic devices is a necessity. So while regulations are being put in place, it's important for us to also note a few areas that enterprises will need to start out on. One is clear identification of these devices and managing all those identities. That is an absolute importance. And that probably forms the foundation for a lot of the security that gets built later on. And then anything related to software, firmware, signed code, firmware compliance or workload compliance, anything related to software that'll need to be built out on top of the identity layer. And then any aspect of compliance needs to be built out as well, whether based on policies, whether this is the level of firmware that should be running on the devices, whether these are the software versions that should be running on the devices. So essentially, as you build out the layers, you need to really start thinking about identity and managing all those identities, and then the firmware and software and managing all of it, and then any kind of compliance that will need to be built on top of it.
Got it. Thank you, Ravi.